some preliminary considerations. The first observation I'm sure you've all made are that these various images of God are in conflict with each other. They contend, they struggle to influence your reading of the book of Job. Second preliminary observation is that none of these images are terribly flattering to deity. They depict what at the very least can be described as ugly or unpleasant aspects of God. It would appear, as I read the book of Job, that the writers or the compilers of this book are deliberately presenting these unpleasant pictures of God for purposes of poking fun at them, for purposes of deconstructing them. There's no way I could believe that the writers, the compilers of the book of Job, saw these images of God as positive, as good, as worthy to be worshipped. So it seems that the writer is deliberately dismantling some very popular notions of God in the Hebrew Bible. Another observation. Having so many images floating around in your head at the same time, they tend to cancel each other out. So we don't have anything left. When we've gotten through the book of Job, it's a perfectly valid and important question to ask, where is he? Where is he? Another consideration. The absence of a positive image of deity in the book of Job might be suggesting something rather important. Might be suggesting, just by its absence, by the shadow, by the hole in the center of the book, that there's some kind of a positive God that's behind all this that we should be looking for. Job seeks, but does not find, a God who will respect him, a God who will defend his innocence, a God who will affirm the injustice of his suffering. As I said, there's an empty space at the heart of the book of Job that is exactly the shape of this absent, unnamed deity that we're all looking for. Job says, chapter 19, verse 25, "But I know that my vindicator lives. In the end he will testify on earth. This after my skin will have been peeled off, but I myself would behold God while still in the flesh. I myself, not another, would behold him, would see him with my own eyes." So really, we have a fifth image lurking in the background. An image that makes its presence known by its absence. It's not there, but it needs to be. It's not there, but we long for it. We long for this hidden, unspoken, absent image of God that somewhere lurks in the background of the book. Got a few concluding responses to what we've heard here. The first one, well, I guess I should tell you what I'm responding to. I'm responding to the presence of these four rather unpleasant images contending to dominate the reading of the book of Job. And my first response is that the book of Job tells us to affirm deity's refusal to be described. Every description of him in the book of Job falls utterly short. Perhaps a reason for this is that God refuses to be described. Every description, every attempt at description is doomed for utter and complete failure. In the book of Genesis, it speaks of humans trying to build a tower reaching up to the heavens. And when it almost seemed like they might succeed, God confounds their language. They can't understand each other anymore. And they go scattering off, settling the rest of the planet. It almost seems that when we try to describe God, God confounds our language and keeps us from doing it. God always remains elusive, one step ahead of our understanding. However, it seems to me that we as humans must continue this process of imaging God, or as I want to reword that, we must continue to tell our stories about God, in the complete awareness that they're doomed to failure and that we'll never be able to describe God or tell stories of God exhaustively or conclusively. I believe that God doesn't want us to stop telling stories, although my first point is that every story is doomed to fail utterly. So I want to close this off by making a few suggestions about the ways we might image God. The absence of a positive image in Job, I think it just leads us along and attracts us and draws us to try to present, to try to create, to try to share with each other images of God which might be more positive, which might be more life-affirming, which might be more humane. So if you accept, if you agree with me that that might be part of the human task, then these are some suggestions about how it might be done, just to start us off. My first suggestion is that the stories we tell about God should not invalidate human experience and human pain, as so many images of God are wont to do. What can you say to the European Jews almost completely exterminated by the Nazis? What can you say to the Cambodians, to the El Salvadorians, or to the Chinese students gunned down in Tiananmen Square? You certainly can't say that you understand why these things happen to them. No way. But at least you can acknowledge that their pain is real. As real human pain, our stories of God must reflect our acknowledgement of genuine human pain. Secondly, it seems to me that in our stories about God, in our imaging of God, we must remain in active dialogue with our traditions, with our communities. We certainly can and do dissent from our traditions, but we can never fully escape them. They are a part of how we create and image God. We don't just kind of walk off all by ourselves and come up with some idea. We work with our communities. We don't make up any image we please. We're responsible to those in whose communities we live and work and worship. This has really come home to me as I'm a relatively new parent, and I begin to realize that all the ideas about God that my children have come from my wife and I. We create the raw materials with which they construct their ideas of God. What an incredible responsibility. Through the stories we tell them, through stories we tell them about our families, through fairy tales, through Bible stories, whatever it is, we are creating an image of God in our children. We create an image of God in our children by the way we live our lives before them. And that's really just the beginning of the community with which we generate these images of God. One last bit of advice. Seems to me that if we are given, as part of our human experience, the choice, the privilege of choosing how we understand God, as I said, with the constraints I mentioned earlier, I urge myself and you as part of this community to choose boldly, to image boldly, to tell dangerous stories about God, to push the boundaries of our understanding. We shouldn't cower under the weight of our traditions, but rather use them creatively and with courage. I believe in the power of invocation, that the God we invoke through our stories, through our prayers, through our liturgies, that this is the God we ultimately come to serve. We've been given such magnificent power. How we employ this power to invoke God has everything to do with the destiny of the human race. Thank you very much. Okay, it is now 8:19, and I will take questions for a few minutes, and then I will officially dismiss, and then if anybody wants to talk further. But are there any questions? Yeah? Well, as I said, I just wanted to get you started. I'll give you just, I think what I did tonight is an example of, at least for me, that was scary. It's very scary to come before a community that's religiously based and say such nasty things about God. And I did it deliberately, but with a great amount of fear in an attempt to push the boundaries, to push things open a little bit, to see the text as it really seems to interact with the reader, and then challenge us to move beyond that. Speaking more, and that's a very negative story. It's a story that we don't want to hear. It's a story that might be a little unpleasant, but it's a story that helps me personally to grow into more directions. Beyond that, I'm very interested in some discussions people are having with exploring images of God as a friend, as a companion, as a lover. Those are very exciting to me. Some people are doing some very creative things, exploring some of the female imagery about God, which is in the Bible, but not quite as in the forefront of our discussions are the appearances of the Bible as some others. So, for instance, imaging God as a caring mother. Best example of that I could think of coming clearly in Scripture is where Jesus says, "How long I would have longed to gather you together to me as a hen gathers its chicks." A very female image of God, or in the Hebrew Bible, my domain. Images of God as groaning in labor, like a woman in childbirth. Those, to me, in our culture, in our society, in our tradition, are very exciting and very dangerous images. And they push the edges of my conceptions of God. Beyond that, I challenge us all to work on this. And I'm just beginning. Yes? Very good and very important question. In fact, two questions. I'll deal with the first one first. What are the restraints? If I'm urging us to push the boundaries, what are the restraints? I believe my second point would lead us to the restraints. We always do this in dialogue with our community. And speaking personally, my own personal sense of loyalty and connectedness with the community is always pulling me back and protecting me from going too far out, or if I do go too far out, it pulls me back. And that to me is the restraint. The second question, I don't know if I can answer it fully. How do I construe God? Who is God to me is what I think you were asking. I'll say first I don't know, but one of the most helpful ideas I've ever been given about God, which really has transformed my own ideas about God, was in a talk I heard a few years ago, which was a presentation from the self-revelation of God's name in Exodus 3, where Moses says to God, "Who am I supposed to say has sent me back to Egypt?" And God says, "Tell them that I am has sent me." No, that's no answer. It's an answer that reveals, but at the same time, it conceals. And what this individual, Lou Silberman, did with that passage is to present an image of God, and he uses some fancy words. I'll tell what he says, and then I'll try to explain it. He says that the ultimate metaphor for who God is And that's really what we're talking about here, is creating metaphors, ways to understand God in human terms. And he says the ultimate metaphor for God, as far as he understands it, is the metaphor of an unmetaphoricity. It's a mouthful, but what does it mean? It means that the ultimate and the best way we could explain God as that being, that person that cannot ever be explained. And that liberated me and helped me enormously. And as I began to read the Hebrew Bible from that context, a lot of things opened up for me. As I saw the ancient Hebrews groping towards some understanding of God and always failing. And yet, in the process of doing so, and in their failures, they come to grips, they encounter the divine presence. And the metaphor of unmetaphoricity has been a very meaningful concept to me personally. And beyond that, I don't know if I want to go right now. Very good questions. Yes? Guys are sharp. I thought of a few ways. The most obvious, going on with this, I want to stress the God's resistance of imaging. And I think that carries over into the New Testament, where Christians believe Jesus is understood, the Christ is understood as the image of the invisible God. But how is Jesus presented to us in the New Testament? He's presented to us in, at very least, 4 separate and distinct versions. We have the 4 Gospels. He's also presented to us from the perspective of Paul the Apostle. He's presented to us from the perspective of the letters of Peter. So we have, even within the very specific and particular Christian context of the Christ as imaging God, we have many perspectives from which we can work into that. Beyond that, I think the stories of Jesus as he presents some metaphors to God, which are very meaningful. God as shepherd, which we heard the first lecture, those of you who were here. God as parent. These are all efforts that are meaningful, that are helpful. But I always want to stress what to me is the most important, is that they are efforts. They are gropings. They are not perfect, essential descriptions of who God is in essence. That is always elusive, and I think even in the New Testament we find it as an elusive concept. Yes? Late in the development of the Hebrew Bible, particularly under Persian influence. Now you're raising a rather controversial issue among biblical scholars, so I'm going to give you my position here. It seems to me that this idea of an independent, evil spiritual personage as a counterpart to God develops in books such as the book of Daniel. Now, what we see in Job is a transitional figure, because we don't have anything remotely like this in some earlier passages, but in books like Daniel, in some of the later prophetic books, we get a sense of this. And then there's that interlude, and then when we get to the New Testament, it's a strongly developed and deeply entrenched concept. So I think it happens very late. And what my understanding of some of the dynamics of this is the tremendous, almost superhuman effort on the part of the Israelites not to share glory between their God and any other divine or spiritual or angelic or supernatural essence. They were very determined to make their God the exclusive possessor of divine power and authority. And that we see very little mention of alternative spiritual figures earlier in the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, I'll have time for one more question. Yes? The commandment, very interesting point, the commandment is not a commandment that forbids us to describe God, but a commandment that forbids us to depict a visual representation of God. The Hebrews were never reluctant to use verbal descriptions of God. They always tried to approach a description of who God was. But in distinction, and it's a rather amazing distinction, in distinction from the common religious sensibility in the ancient world, they were not to make any, the technical term would be a plastic representation, a physical representation where somebody could point to that thing and say, either this is your God or this adequately or meaningfully represents your God. The Israelite theologians were very reluctant to do that, perhaps partly because they didn't want there to be any possible confusion of their God with physical objects on the earth. So that's the way I really would understand that.